morning sun cast long shadows across the training ground as Arya watched her husband practice his sword work. Victor moved with the steady grace of someone who had spent 20 years perfecting his craft. His blade caught the light as he went through the familiar motions, each strike deliberate and controlled. She had seen him practice this same routine every morning for the past 5 years of their marriage, and it never failed to give her comfort. Their village of Thornhaven nestled in a valley surrounded by rolling hills and ancient oak trees. It was a peaceful place where children played in the streets and merchants sold their wares in the town square. The people here lived by old traditions, customs that had been passed down through generations. Some of these customs seemed strange to outsiders, but they had kept the peace for centuries. Arya was tending to her herb garden when the messenger arrived. The young boy was dusty from his long ride and could barely catch his breath as he delivered the formal challenge. A warrior named Darius from the northern settlements was claiming rights to their valley. According to the ancient laws, when someone challenged for territory, it had to be settled through single combat. Victor read the message twice, his weathered face showing no emotion. But Arya knew him well enough to see the tension in his shoulders. This was not what any of them had expected. Their valley had been peaceful for so long that most people had forgotten such challenges could still happen. The rules were clear and unchanging. The challenge had to be accepted within 3 days. The combat would take place at sunset in the sacred circle of stones that stood at the center of their valley. Weapons would be swords and shields, nothing more. The winner would claim not just the land, but everything that came with it. That included the defeated warrior's household, his property, and according to the oldest customs. His wife, Arya, felt her stomach turn as she realized what this meant. If Victor lost, she would belong to this stranger named Darius. It was an ancient law that most people hoped would never be tested. But here they were, facing the reality of traditions that suddenly felt very real and very frightening. The news spread through the village like wildfire. People gathered in small groups. Speaking in hushed tones, the elders met in the great hall to discuss the situation. Some suggested they could refuse the challenge, but everyone knew that would bring shame upon their entire community. Others wondered if they could negotiate, but the message had been clear. This Darius wanted their fertile valley, and he was willing to fight for it. Victor spent the next 2 days preparing. He sharpened his sword until it gleamed like silver. He practiced his footwork until his boots wore grooves in the dirt. He studied the ancient fighting techniques that his father had taught him. Despite all his preparation, Arya could see the worry in his eyes. She learned more about their challenger from the traveling merchants who passed through the village. Darius was not just any warrior. He was known throughout the northern territories as someone who had never lost a duel. He was younger than Victor, faster, and driven by an ambition that made him dangerous. Some said he had already claimed 3 other valleys through combat. Others whispered that he was collecting territories to build his own kingdom. The night before the challenge, Arya and Victor sat by their fireplace, neither of them speaking much. They had been married for 5 good years, and their life together had been filled with simple joys. Victor made furniture in his workshop, creating beautiful chairs and tables that people came from other villages to buy. Arya grew medicinal herbs and helped deliver babies when the village women needed assistance. They had built a quiet, happy life together. Now all of that was about to be decided by a single fight. Victor finally broke the silence. He told her about his father, who had once faced a similar challenge when Victor was just a boy. His father had won that day, but not without cost. The defeated challenger had been someone from their own village, a friend who had become consumed by jealousy and pride. The victory had saved their family, but it had also taught Victor about the weight of these ancient traditions as the sun began to set on the day of the challenge. The entire village gathered around the stone circle. The sacred space was older than anyone could remember, with 7 massive stones arranged in a perfect circle. Local legends said that important decisions had been made in this circle for over 1,000 years. Now, it would witness another chapter in that long history. Darius arrived exactly at sunset, riding a black horse and wearing armor that had clearly seen many battles. He was everything the stories had described: tall, powerful, and carrying himself with the confidence of someone who had never known defeat. His dark hair was pulled back, and his piercing eyes swept across the crowd. Before settling on Victor, the two men entered the circle as the village elders spoke the ancient words that would begin the combat. Arya watched from her place among the other villagers, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it over the elder's voice. She studied Darius's face, trying to understand what kind of man would destroy a peaceful community for his own gain. The rules were simple. The fight would continue until one man yielded or could no longer continue. There would be no mercy, no second chances. The winner would claim everything, and the loser would lose everything. It was brutal in its simplicity, but it was there. As the elder finished speaking and stepped back, Victor and Darius drew their swords. The metal rang clearly in the evening air, and Arya felt her world begin to change forever. The clash of steel echoed across the valley as Victor and Darius circled each other in the ancient stone circle. Arya watched every movement, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. The two warriors moved like dancers at first, testing each other's speed and technique. Victor's swordwork was precise and calculated, each strike flowing into the next with the grace of years of practice. But Darius fought with a different energy entirely. He was like a storm given human form, his attacks coming in powerful waves. That seemed to push Victor back step by step. The younger warrior's blade moved with devastating speed. Arya could see that he was not just skilled, but hungry for victory in a way that made him dangerous. The fight lasted longer than anyone expected. Victor held his ground well, using his experience to counter Darius's aggressive style. For a moment, it seemed like the older warrior might actually win. He landed a solid strike that sent Darius stumbling backward, and the crowd began to murmur with hope. Then everything changed in an instant. Darius recovered faster than anyone thought possible, spinning around Victor's next attack and bringing his sword down in a move that was both brilliant and brutal. Victor's weapon flew from his hands, clattering across the stone ground. Before he could recover, Darius's blade was at his throat, and the fight was over. The silence that followed was deafening. Victor knelt in the dirt, defeated but alive. Darius had won fairly according to their ancient laws, and now everything would change. The village elder stepped forward to declare the official result, his voice shaking as he spoke the words that would transfer ownership of their valley to this stranger. Arya felt like she was watching someone else's life unfold. This couldn't be real. Minutes ago, she had been a respected member of their community, married to a man she loved, living in the home they had built together. Now she was being told that she belonged to Darius, a man she had never spoken to and knew nothing about. The customs were clear about what happened next. As the wife of the defeated warrior, she would become part of Darius's household, not as his wife, but as his concubine. The distinction was important in their society. The concubine had certain rights and protections, but she was still considered property rather than a partner. It was a position that many women had held throughout their history. But Arya had never imagined it would be her fate. Darius approached her as the crowd began to disperse. Up close, he was even more intimidating than she had expected. His presence seemed to fill the space around him, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. He told her to gather her personal belongings and be ready to move to his residence by morning. He spoke to her the same way he might address a servant, polite but distant. There was no cruelty in his tone, but there was no warmth either. To him, she was simply part of what he had won, different from the furniture or livestock that now belonged to him. That night, Arya packed her few precious possessions into a small wooden chest. She folded her wedding dress carefully, even though she knew she would never wear it again. She gathered her collection of herb seeds and the small silver mirror that had belonged to her mother. Each item she packed felt like she was saying goodbye. To a piece of herself, Victor was allowed to stay in the village, but he was no longer the man he had been. Defeat had stripped away more than just his property. His confidence was gone, replaced by a hollow look that broke Arya's heart. They were allowed one final conversation before she left, and they both struggled to find words for what was happening to them. The next morning, Arya walked to what had been her home for 5 years. Darius had moved in during the night, and already, the place felt different. He had rearranged the furniture to suit his preferences and brought in his own belongings. The house that had once been filled with her laughter and Victor's gentle presence now felt cold and unwelcoming. Darius showed her to a small room at the back of the house. It was clean and furnished with a bed, a chair, and a small table, but it was clearly servants' quarters. This was where she would live now, separated from the main part of the house where Darius conducted his business and entertained his followers. The other women in the village didn't know how to treat her anymore. Some avoided her entirely, as if her changed status might somehow be catching. Others offered her pitying looks that made her feel even worse. A few of the older women, who remembered when such arrangements had been more common, tried to give her advice about how to survive in her new position. They told her to keep her head down and do as she was told. They suggested that if she was useful and caused no trouble, Darius might treat her well. Some even hinted that if she was clever, she might eventually earn a position of influence in his household. But all of their advice felt like learning to live in a cage, and Arya wasn't sure she was ready to accept that yet. Darius treated her with the same distant politeness he had shown at their first meeting. He gave her tasks around the house, expecting them to be completed efficiently and without question. He provided her with adequate food and clothing, but nothing more than what was necessary. It was clear that he saw her as a useful addition to his household, but not as a person with her own thoughts and feelings. As the days passed, Arya began to understand the reality of her new life. She was no longer free to make her own choices or follow her own interests. Every aspect of her day was now determined by Darius's needs and preferences. She woke when he required her services, ate when he allowed it, and went to bed when her duties were finished. But even as she adapted to these new circumstances, Arya never stopped watching and learning. She observed how Darius ran his household, how he dealt with the village leaders, and how he planned to manage his newly acquired territory. She was beginning to understand that if she was going to survive in this new world, she would need to be much more than just a passive victim of circumstance. 3 weeks had passed since Arya's life changed forever. She was beginning to notice things about Darius that others seemed to miss. During the day, he was the powerful warrior everyone feared and respected. He gave orders with confidence, settled disputes with firm authority, and commanded the loyalty of his men through sheer force of personality. But at night, when the house grew quiet and he thought no one was watching, she saw a different side of him. Arya had always been a light sleeper, and in her new quarters at the back of the house, she could hear when Darius left his room in the middle of the night. At first, she thought he was simply restless from sleeping in an unfamiliar place. But as the nights passed, she realized this was a regular pattern. He would slip out of the house just before dawn and walk to the training ground, where he would practice his sword work alone in the darkness. One morning, curiosity got the better of her. She quietly followed him and watched from behind a tree as he went through his exercises. What she saw surprised her. This wasn't the confident warrior she had come to know. His movements were sharp and aggressive, almost angry, struck at invisible enemies with a fury that seemed to come from deep inside him. Sometimes he would stop suddenly and stare off into the distance, as if he was seeing something that wasn't there. During her daily tasks around the house, Arya began to pay closer attention to the small details that revealed who Darius really was. She noticed that he kept a small wooden box on his desk, and sometimes she would catch him holding something from inside it while staring out the window. She saw that he ate very little, often pushing food around his plate without taking more than a few bites. Most telling of all, she observed that he never seemed to truly relax, even when he was alone. The first real conversation between them happened by accident. Darius had returned from a hunting trip with a deep cut on his arm from a wild boar's. Tuska's men had wanted to call for the village healer, but he had dismissed them, saying it was just a scratch. When Arya saw him struggling to clean the wound properly, stepped forward without thinking. She had always been good with healing herbs and treating injuries. Back when she was married to Victor, she had helped many villagers with their ailments. Now, seeing Darius's obvious pain, her natural instincts took over. She offered to help, expecting him to refuse or dismiss her like he usually did. Instead, he looked at her for a long moment, as if he was seeing her for the first time. Then he nodded and sat down, allowing her to examine the wound. It was deeper than he had admitted, and she could see that it would need careful attention to heal properly. As she worked, cleaning the cut and applying a healing salve made from the herbs in her garden, they began to talk. At first their conversation was simple and practical. She explained what she was doing and why each herb would help, he asked. Questions about her knowledge of healing, genuinely interested in her answers. But as she worked, the conversation gradually became more personal. He mentioned that he had learned basic wound care from his sister, who had been skilled in the healing arts. The mention of his sister seemed to open something in Darius that had been tightly closed. He told Arya about how his sister had been taken during a raid on their village when he was just 17 years old. She had been 2 years younger than him, full of life and laughter, with dreams of becoming a healer like their grandmother. The raiders had come in the night, and by the time Darius had gathered the other young men to fight them off, his sister was gone. As Arya listened, she began to understand the driving force behind Darius's ambition. Every territory he claimed, every battle he fought was part of his search for information about what had happened to his sister. He had been following leads and rumors for years, building his power and influence so that he would have the resources to find her, or at least learn her fate. The weight of carrying this burden alone had clearly taken its toll on him. Arya could see it in the way his shoulders sagged as he spoke about his sister, and in the exhaustion that seemed to go deeper than just physical tiredness. He had been driven by this mission for so long that he had forgotten how to be anything other than a warrior seeking answers. Over the following days, their interactions began to change. Darius started asking for Arya's opinion on small matters around the house. He noticed when she reorganized his papers in a way that made them easier to find. He appreciated the meals she prepared, which were more flavorful than what his men usually cooked. These were small things, but they represented a shift in how he saw her. Arya, for her part, began to assert herself in subtle ways. She took initiative in managing the household, making improvements that benefited everyone. She used her knowledge of the local area to help Darius understand the best places to graze livestock and where to find the sweetest water sources. She even offered suggestions about how to approach some of the village leaders who had been resistant to accepting him as their new ruler. One evening, she was tending to the herb garden behind the house. Darius joined her. He had never shown interest in her plants before, but now he asked questions about what she was growing and how each herb was used. She explained that some were for healing, others for cooking, and a few were simply beautiful to look at. As she talked, she noticed that he seemed more relaxed than she had ever seen him. They began to spend more time together in the evenings, sometimes talking about practical matters, sometimes sharing stories from their past lives. Arya learned that Darius had once wanted to be a teacher before his sister's disappearance changed everything. He discovered that she had always dreamed of traveling to distant places, though she had never had the opportunity. But even as their relationship grew more comfortable, Arya never forgot the circumstances that had brought them together. She was still there, against her will, still bound by customs that gave her no choice in the matter. The growing understanding between them was genuine, but it was built on a foundation of inequality that she could never quite ignore. Sometimes late at night, she would lie in her small room and wonder what her life might have been like if she had met Darius under different circumstances. Would they have been friends? Could they have been something more? These thoughts both comforted and troubled her, because they reminded her that even positive changes in her situation were still happening within the confines of her captivity. The messenger arrived on a cold autumn morning, his horse lathered with sweat from a hard ride. Arya was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when she heard the commotion outside. Through the window, she could see Darius speaking with the young rider, his face growing darker with each word. When he finally dismissed the messenger and strode into the house, she could feel the tension radiating from him like heat from a forge. The news was troubling. a rival clan from the eastern mountains, was moving toward their valley with a large force of warriors. Their leader was someone named Castor, a man known for his ruthless tactics and his desire to expand his territory. The messenger had brought word that Castor's army was less than 3 days away, and they were coming to claim what Darius had worked so hard to build. Arya watched as Darius immediately shifted into the role of a military commander. He sent riders to gather his allies from the surrounding areas. He organized the village's defenses and began planning how to position his forces for the coming battle. But as she observed his preparations, Arya realized she knew something that could change everything. Castor was her cousin, the son of her father's brother. She had grown up hearing stories about him from her family, and she knew his weaknesses better than anyone. He was proud and impulsive, quick to anger when his plans didn't work perfectly. More importantly, she knew his preferred battle tactics because she had listened to her uncle boast about his son's victories. During family gatherings, the question that burned in her mind was whether she should help Darius or remain silent. She said nothing. Castor might win the battle, and she could potentially be freed from her current situation. But she also knew that Castor was far more cruel than Darius had ever been. Under his rule, the peaceful valley would become a place of fear and oppression. For 2 days, Arya wrestled with her decision. She watched Darius work tirelessly to prepare for the battle, barely sleeping as he checked and rechecked every detail of his defense plans. She saw the worry in his eyes when he thought no one was looking. She recognized the weight of responsibility he carried for all the people who now depended on him. On the morning before the battle, Arya made her choice. She found Darius in his study, poring over maps and trying to guess where Castor would attack first. Without announcing herself, she walked in and began to speak. She told him that she knew his enemy personally, and she could help him win if he was willing to listen. Darius looked up from his maps, surprise clear on his face. This was the first time since her arrival that Arya had taken such initiative. She explained her relationship to Castor and offered to share what she knew about his fighting style and strategic preferences, but she also made it clear that her help would come with conditions. The conversation that followed was unlike any they had shared before. Arya spoke with a confidence and authority that surprised both of them. She told Darius that she was tired of being treated like a piece of property. She was going to help him defend their valley. She wanted to be treated as a partner in its governance, not just as a concubine who happened to be useful. Darius's first reaction was anger. He was not accustomed to being challenged, especially by someone who was supposed to be under his authority. He reminded her of the customs that governed their relationship and the fact that she had no right to make demands of him. He spoke. Arya could see that her words had struck something deeper in him. She didn't back down. Instead, she pointed out all the ways she had already proven her worth. She had managed his household more efficiently than it had ever been managed before. She had helped him understand the local customs and traditions that made governing easier. She had even helped him build better relationships with some of the village leaders who had initially been resistant to his rule. More than that, she reminded him of the conversations they had shared in recent weeks. She had listened to his fears about his sister and offered comfort when he needed it. She had seen him at his most vulnerable and had never used that knowledge against him. If he wanted her loyalty and support, he needed to give her the respect she had earned. The argument between them was intense but not hostile. It was the kind of disagreement that happens between equals who care about each other but have different perspectives on an important issue. Darius challenged her assumptions, and she challenged his. They both said things they had been thinking for weeks but had never dared to voice. Finally, Darius asked her the question that had been hanging between them. Why was she willing to help him win this battle? She could have remained silent and potentially gained her freedom when Castor arrived. What did she hope to gain by ensuring Darius's victory? Arya's answer was honest and complicated. She told him that she had come to care about the people in their valley, and she knew they would suffer under Castor's rule. She also admitted that she had grown to respect Darius, despite the circumstances that had brought them together. But most importantly, she said that she was tired of being a victim of other people's decisions. She wanted to have a voice in shaping her own future. Information Arya provided proved to be invaluable. She told Darius about Castor's tendency to attack at dawn, believing that surprise was more important than tactical positioning. She explained how her cousin preferred to split his forces, using a smaller group to create a distraction while launching his main attack from an unexpected direction. She even knew that Castor had a superstition about fighting near running water, which meant he would avoid the stream that ran along the valley's eastern edge. Using this knowledge, Darius was able to set up a defense that turned Castor's own tactics against him. When the attack came, Darius's forces were ready. They allowed Castor's diversionary force to think they were succeeding, while positioning their main strength to counter the real attack. The battle was fierce but relatively short, ending with Castor's defeat and his retreat back to the mountains. The victory celebration that night was different from anything the valley had seen before. For the first time since becoming part of Darius's household, Arya stood beside him as he addressed the gathered crowd. She was not hidden in the background or relegated to serving duties. Instead, she was acknowledged as someone who had played a crucial role in their success. The change in how people treated her was immediate and noticeable. The other villagers began to speak to her with the respect due to someone who held real influence. Darius's own men, who had previously ignored her or treated her as just another servant, now sought her opinions on matters related to the valley's governance. But perhaps the most significant change was in Darius himself. The partnership that had emerged from their confrontation seemed to have awakened something in him that had been dormant for years. He began to consult with Arya on decisions that affected the entire community, valuing her insights and perspective. Their relationship had evolved from captor and captive to something that resembled genuine collaboration. As autumn turned to winter, Arya found herself in a position she had never imagined when she first arrived in Darius's household. She was still technically bound by the same customs that had brought her there. But in practice, she had become his trusted advisor and partner. It was a strange and unexpected transformation, but one that gave her hope that her future might be brighter than she had dared to believe. Winter was giving way to spring when the second messenger arrived, and this time the news would change everything. Arya was working in her expanded herb garden, planning which new plants to grow in the coming season, when she heard the horses' hooves on the cobblestones. Something about the urgency of the sound made her look up from her work, and she saw Darius emerge from the house with an expression she had never seen before. The messenger was an older man, weathered by years of hard travel, and he carried himself with the gravity of someone bearing momentous news. As he spoke with Darius, Arya watched the warrior's face transform from curiosity to shock to something that looked like desperate hope. When the conversation ended and the messenger was led away for food and rest, Darius stood alone in the courtyard, staring at nothing. Later that evening, as they sat together by the fire, Darius told her what he had learned. His sister was alive. After all these years of searching, of following false leads and chasing rumors, someone had finally brought him concrete information about her fate. She was being held captive by a distant clan in the far northern territories, a place so remote that few people had ever heard of it. Arya watched as Darius explained what the messenger had told him. His sister had been sold to this northern clan shortly after her capture, and she had been living there ever since. The clan leader was willing to negotiate for her release, but his price was enormous. He wanted all of the territories that Darius had claimed, plus a substantial payment in gold and livestock. Essentially, he was demanding that Darius give up everything he had built over the years. The choice before Darius was impossible. He could keep his lands and his position, but abandon his sister forever. Or he could sacrifice everything he had worked for to bring her home. As he spoke, Arya could see the pain in his eyes. This was the moment he had been working toward for years, but it was nothing like what he had imagined. Over the next few days, Arya watched Darius struggle with his decision. He barely slept, spending his nights walking the boundaries of his territory as if he was memorizing every stone and tree. During the day, he went through the motions of his duties, but his mind was clearly elsewhere. She could see that he was preparing to give up everything for his sister. even though it would mean destroying the lives of all the people who now depended on him. The weight of the decision was crushing him, and Arya knew she had to do something. She had grown to care deeply about Darius over the past months, and she couldn't stand to watch him tear himself apart. More than that, she had her own reasons for wanting to find a solution. The valley had become her home too, and she didn't want to see it fall into the hands of whoever might claim it after Darius left. The idea came to her gradually, taking shape over several sleepless nights, as she knew these northern territories better than Darius realized. Her mother had come from that region, and Arya had grown up hearing stories about the various clans and their customs. She also had connections there. Distant relatives who might be willing to help if approached correctly, instead of paying the enormous ransom demanded by the clan leader. Arya proposed a different approach. She would travel to the northern territories herself, using her family connections to negotiate directly with the people who mattered. She was confident that she could find a way to secure the sisters' release without requiring Darius to give up everything he had built. When she first presented this idea to Darius, his reaction was immediate and firm. He refused to even consider it. The journey would be dangerous, and he wasn't willing to risk her safety for something that might not work. But Arya persisted, explaining her reasoning and demonstrating that she had thought through all the potential problems and solutions. The conversation went on for hours, with both of them presenting arguments and counterarguments. Darius worried about the risks she would face traveling through hostile territory. Arya pointed out that her family connections would actually make her safer than an armed delegation would be. He argued that the northern clans couldn't be trusted to honor any agreement they might make. She countered that her approach was more likely to succeed because it would be based on relationships and mutual respect rather than fear. Finally, Darius asked her the question that had been underlying their entire discussion. Why was she willing to do this for him? She could have simply accepted that he would have to leave, which would free her from their arrangement. Instead, she was proposing to undertake a dangerous mission that would keep him in power and maintain her own complicated position. Arya's answer surprised both of them with its honesty. She told him that somewhere in the complexity of their relationship, she had found something she hadn't expected. It wasn't love exactly, but it was something deeper than mere partnership. She had come to respect him as a leader and to value the life they had built together. More importantly, she had discovered that she didn't want to go back to being someone else's property or decision. The most shocking part of the conversation came when Darius made her an offer she had never anticipated. He told her that regardless of what happened with his sister, he would release her from all obligations to him. She could leave whenever she wanted, with his blessing and enough resources to build a new life wherever she chose. She would be truly free for the first time since their arrangement began. As Arya considered this offer, she realized that it represented everything she had thought she wanted. Freedom from the customs that had bound her, the chance to make her own choices, and the opportunity to build a life based on her own preferences rather than someone else's demands. But as she thought about it, she discovered that her feelings were more complicated than she had realized. Over the months they had spent together, she and Darius had built something that neither of them had expected. They had become true partners in governing the valley, working together to solve problems and make decisions that affected everyone's lives. She had found a sense of purpose and accomplishment that she had never experienced before. The idea of leaving all of that behind felt like a loss rather than a liberation. The preparations for her journey took several weeks. Darius insisted on providing her with the best horses and supplies, along with a small escort to accompany her through the more dangerous parts of the route. He also gave her letters of introduction to various contacts who might be helpful, though they both knew that her family connections would be more valuable than any formal credentials. The night before her departure, they had their most honest conversation yet. Darius admitted that he had come to see her as much more than just a concubine or even a valued advisor. She had become someone he trusted completely, someone whose judgment he valued above his own in many situations. He told her that losing her would be almost as painful as losing his sister had been. Arya's response was equally honest. She told him that she had never expected to find happiness in the circumstances that had brought them together, but somehow, she had. She had discovered strengths in herself that she didn't know existed. She had found a sense of purpose that gave meaning to her life. More than that, she had found someone who truly saw her as an equal. Despite the customs that said otherwise, the journey to the Northern Territories was long and challenging. But Arya's family connections proved to be even more valuable than she had hoped. Her mother's relatives welcomed her warmly and were eager to help once they understood the situation. Through patient negotiation and careful relationship building, she was able to arrange for the sisters' release without requiring the massive payment that had originally been demanded. When she returned to the valley several months later, she brought with her not just Darius's sister, but also a new understanding of her own worth and capabilities. She had proven to herself that she could accomplish difficult things on her own, that she had value beyond what any custom or tradition might say about her. The reunion between Darius and his sister was everything he had hoped for and more. But perhaps more significant was the conversation he had with Arya after the celebrations had ended. He formally offered her the position of co-leader of their territory, with all the rights and responsibilities that came with it. It was an unprecedented arrangement, but one that recognized the reality of what their partnership had become. Arya accepted his offer, but with conditions of her own. She wanted their arrangement to be based on mutual choice rather than ancient customs. She wanted to be free to leave if she ever chose to, and she wanted him to have the same freedom. Most importantly, she wanted their partnership to be built on respect and equality rather than on the traditions that had originally brought them together. As spring turned to summer, the valley flourished under their joint leadership. The people had accepted Arya as Darius's equal partner, and their combined strengths made them more effective than either could have been alone. What had begun as a story of conquest and tradition had evolved into something entirely different, a partnership based on mutual respect, shared goals, and genuine care for each other's well-being. Looking back, Arya realized that her journey had taken her to a place she never could have imagined. She had started as a victim of circumstances beyond her control, but she had found a way to become the author of her own story.